And so the power brokers who exist in the Pashtun areas, these are people who are corrupt, but also who have their own connections to the Taliban. After all, the drug traffickers, who are they making their deals with? The Taliban. Who is it that's benefiting from the contracts that are given out by NATO? Hey, what you do, NATO comes in, it hires Afghans to be security contractors. The security contractors, since it's rather inconvenient to have your people killed, they pay off the Taliban not to attack. If on occasion the NATO says, well, maybe we don't need those security contracts, you arrange with the Taliban to have a few attacks so you can have those contracts continue. There are close family and tribal relations between the Taliban and the people who are supposedly on our side. And that then goes to, those relationships go to the difficulty of the counterinsurgency strategy. Because suppose you go into an area like Marja, you secure it. Well, of course, you don't have a government that can be credible or provide honest administration. But even if you can provide security, imagine what happens if you're a citizen of Marja and you decide you're going to rat out a hardline Taliban person, perhaps a bomb maker. If the word gets back to the local power broker, as it certainly will, there's a good chance that he's going to tip off the Taliban, and you end up dead or some member of your family ends up dead. In essence, what you have is a mafia state. And so the kind of conventional counterinsurgency arrangements simply don't work. So let me stop with simply a question or two questions to Michael O'Hanlon. Michael, would you agree that in order for a let me three. First, do you agree our strategy is a counterinsurgency strategy? One. Two, would you agree that for a counterinsurgency strategy to work, you need to have a credible local partner? And do you believe that Hamid Karzai's government is a credible partner?
And thank you for those questions and the invitation. And it's an honor to be here tonight. Before I respond, and I think this is a very good way to frame it, I just want to say the last time I was in a debate with Peter Galbraith, he was on my team. That was a lot more fun. And so wish me well. But let me also now, by way of prefacing my response, I think this was a very nice way to sort of set me up for my comments. Let me say that the book that John kindly mentioned that I had written was with an Afghan woman named Hasina Sherjan, and I'm sure Minister Jalali and other Afghans in the group probably have encountered her over the years. And we just did a book event together on Saturday, and someone asked her a question, and I want to begin with this question briefly first and then get to Peter's. You know, isn't it typical of the United States to always be getting its paw prints all over all the problems around the world? Wouldn't we just be better off recognizing that we don't do any good here, that Afghans just want to be left alone, that we make the problem worse, not better, by trying to help them establish a new government? And Hasina's jaw just hit the table. And the number of assumptions behind this comment that were, to her, demonstrably wrong was striking. First of all, she said, as if you, the world, ever considered leaving us alone. The reason we're in this mess is because you didn't leave us alone. Have you heard about the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan? Have you heard about the Mujahideen coming in from Pakistan? Of course we had problems after that because the world decided that whatever fledgling Afghan state was beginning to emerge, admittedly a weak state, admittedly an unusual anthropology, a complex urban-rural kind of mix of demographics and economics, in the 1970s in Afghanistan, but you, the world, didn't give us the opportunity to build on what we were trying to put together. You destroyed our state, not once, not twice, but arguably 3 different times. And now you finally get around to paying a little bit of attention to us after 9/11. The Taliban were in power a long time and you didn't care. After 9/11, you decide maybe you can get around to paying a little attention, and now things start to go south and you want to talk about getting out quickly. So that was just one Afghan's response to the basic notion of whether the United States and the international community have any business being in this place. And I think it's worth remembering that kind of perspective because we often, criticize ourselves for being quasi-imperialistic, hegemonic, not understanding other cultures. That was her response to that proposition. Now let me try to talk a little bit about Peter's questions. And they were very good questions. And I agree that, yes, our strategy is a counterinsurgency strategy. We tried the more limited counterterrorism strategy for 5 or 6 years. It didn't work. So we've now reverted to a counterinsurgency strategy to achieve a counterterrorism objective, because it's the only promising way to get there. So yes, I agree on that point. Yes, I agree that you need a credible, or at least viable, or at least passable indigenous partner ultimately to make that work. And I'm not sure about whether President Karzai can be that partner. So he's got me. He's identified my own misgivings, and I cannot be a comparably strong voice of optimism to balance his voice of pessimism, because I am sort of a glass 55, 60% full kind of person on Afghanistan. And if we have this debate again in a year, Peter and I might be teammates again. Because if there's one thing about Obama's deadline that I do agree with, I'm not sure how crazy I am about the July 2011 construct, but I do agree that if this strategy is not showing considerable signs of hopefulness over the next 12 months, we have to fundamentally reassess. And I'm not sure it's a given that we will be successful. Okay, having said all of that, let me spend a little more time on question 3 and on why I think the nuance in my answer is important and not entirely without some hopefulness. First of all, it's not all about Karzai. Now, yes, he's important. He's the 2-time president of this country. He may have every hope and aspiration of being the 3-, and 4-, and 5-time president of this country. One more issue Peter could have raised and maybe mercifully didn't was, do we really think Karzai will step down in 2014? And I don't know. But let me say a few other things before I come back, and I'll finish on Karzai, about whom I have complex views. And I would not really disagree with most of the specific points Peter made, but I would add a lot of somewhat more encouraging points as well. But let me not start with Karzai. Let me start with the Afghan people, with the Afghan army, not so much the police. We'll get to that later, but more the people and the army. The Afghan people are obviously a complex anthropology, a complex community. They have a lot of different views. Peter's already identified some of the divides geographically and ethnically. There's also, of course, a traditional urban-rural divide, very different groups of people in those two different parts of the country. But a couple things about the Afghan people. First of all, we know, unless you don't think any of the polls and surveys have any validity whatsoever, we know they don't want the Taliban back. The Taliban consistently score single-digit percentages in the popularity ratings. Now, you could say, well, we're not sampling in the places where the Taliban's most popular. That's probably true. Go ahead and double the number, triple the number. You're still talking about 10, 15% popularity for the Taliban. They've lived this movie already. They don't want to relive it. That's pretty emphatically clear. The Afghan people do not want to return to those days. By the way, one of the reasons I believe at least some of the polling story, not the numbers accurately and precisely, but some of the story, is because if you look at these surveys over time, they make sense on a number of other issues. For example, their confidence in us declined year by year by year by year. From a peak of around 90%, George W. Bush, November 2001 levels, originally that was how we scored in Afghanistan, down to 60, 50, 40%. This number has bounced up a bit in the last year or so, and I want to give Peter credit for his service because he and many others have done everything they could with varying degrees of ultimate satisfaction in what they were able to accomplish to try to give the Afghans some more renewed hope this last year. And the Afghans have shown a little more happiness about the international effort and a bit more optimism about the future. But fundamentally, their optimism has gone down. Their views about us have declined, become more negative, and yet they still say they despise the Taliban. And that tells me something about who they are and what they want.